Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope I'm going live about now. Today is a stream that I will have trouble focusing on because my entire brain is wired towards the US election. I have all my tech ready. I have a dozen topics prepared or at the very least ready as links in my Safari. So today is just for my personal distraction. It will be very free form. You can ask questions, give suggestions. Usually I try to incorporate all of you anyway, but this is going to be one where I really have to find something else beyond like Apple stuff so that we can potentially keep talking for hours, or I might get emotionally exhausted and finish in an hour and then delete the stream forever. So however you choose to join, however you choose to support, whether you do all the YouTube jazz as we call it around here by liking the video, subscribing to the channel, sharing it out to anybody who you think might enjoy it, and of course commenting both live and afterwards, it's all very much appreciated. Of course, you can also soothe my beating heart with a direct donation in the form of a super chat or a super sticker right here in the live chat. You can become a channel member here on YouTube. Shout out to Angelica, Steve, and Max Maximus, who are all MarkCheck Pro Max supporters right here on YouTube, or you can become a supporter over on Patreon. With that all out of the way, here's a small glimpse into how much I have prepared. Some of the tabs will be covered up by my face, I guess, but it's better that way. I have made plans. Don't misunderstand me. So I actually have some content that is better with my face in that corner. I know sometimes I will move my face depending on whether we are watching a video or something like that. But yeah, today it is still correct in that right hand side top corner. I see my video is working well. So I will be starting. I apologize. I'm so freaking nervous. Even my grandma, who is like originally from Belarus and who half her life lived with elections that were like, oh, you know what? We already know who wins like 5 months in advance or whatever. The party has decided. And she was like calling me for an entire hour yesterday. And she's like, oh my God, could Trump really win? Stuff like that. And I'm like, I don't know. I'm equally as nervous, even though I'm very well read and all that stuff. But let's actually get to the good old Apple stuff here. And actually, the first one is quite interesting. It's a fresh piece of news. It's about displays, which I know a lot of us on this channel like to discuss. I know some of us just wish finally to get the perfect like tandem OLED screen from Apple as like a large screen experience. I know at some point Apple could even push technologies to 240 hertz or something like that. But I think for most people, like above 90 really is hard to tell apart. So many people would just be happy with like a 120 hertz screen, especially one that, well, does support variable refresh rate, but might not necessarily adjust its refresh rate for things like a scrolling, right? So everything is just peaked at 120. Games dynamically adjust. Maybe your graphics card cannot render a certain game at certain settings at 120 hertz. So if that game runs between like 70 and 90, thanks to VRR, it still looks perfectly smooth. If you're watching like a 24 hertz movie, the screen refreshes at 48 hertz. Technically, that would even give you like the option to do like an in-between, like just dark screen refresh, like a black frame insertion or something like that. And yeah, down the road, go all crazy 240. But that's not the screens we are going to talk about. And NMLV joining the chat, I believe a relatively new supporter from the last week craziness. The display you want somehow never exists. Yeah, I understand that, because for some people, like, they want just a perfect screen, right? And they're ready to pay good dollar for it. And some people are just looking at the iPad and they're like, you really put this like best ever screen possibly in an iPad Pro at $1,300, and for some reason we cannot pay you like $3,000 for a MacBook Pro to get that screen and in a fully featured computer, or for example, even pay you like $2,500 and get that in a 27-inch display, right? That is standalone, might be for 5K, doesn't need to have the absolute highest pixel density ever. 220 is plenty on a large screen. And if you are in the cheaper market, right, you're like, man, I don't need all that craziness of HDR and mini LED and the most advanced OLED. Could I please have a slightly higher refresh rate, like LCD panel, right? At least something that is a little bit faster, has faster response times, has obviously faster refresh rate overall, maybe has some higher peak brightness, right? Nothing crazy. And unfortunately, Apple knows that you think like that, so they want to push people who would otherwise be happy with like a 90 or 120 hertz screen LCD to like a mini LED or an OLED 120 hertz screen by denying those cheaper screens higher refresh rates. And they want to prime people that already pay premium dollar to at some point pay even more for like a tandem OLED solution, right? Because to me, it is absolutely out of the question that when the MacBook Pro tandem OLED launches, Apple doesn't find a reason to somehow increase pricing, right? By that point, it will also coincide with Apple's first 2-nanometer processors. It will likely have like maybe double the base storage, because by 2026, if your device costs $2,000, you might as well give it 1 terabyte. And at that point, once you give it that expensive screen, that even more expensive chip, why not price it at $2,200 and say, oh, look, technically the 1 terabyte version costs as much as it did before, but now the base pricing is gone. I mean, similar to what Apple did with the iPhone 15 Pro Max, where they removed the 128 gigabyte version and just made everyone go 256 or higher, but kept at least the pricing of the 256 model the same. And that is the more optimistic prediction. There is a chance that Apple would increase pricing to like $2,400 or something like that. I need the Studio Display refresh to release in 2025 so bad. Yeah, it's a shame, because I mean, like, before we get into the actual news, right? If we look at the state of the Studio Display, and let's even just look at the dollar prices, the US prices, right? So Mac Studio displays, there too. So Studio Display buy. I know you can often buy it below MSRP at like around $1,400. But let's just discuss where we'd expect it to hit. And MLV saying it will make much more sense when Pros are all OLED and Airs, etc., are just ProMotion LCDs. Yes, this is partially what I will be talking about once we get to actually today's rumor and leaks. Nia Tran saying better bring it to the new iPhone. The iPhone is a little different because the iPhone is actually expensive across the board, right? Even at $800 and $900, right? The iPhone still outpaces good, of course, if we look at like the old Xiaomi Ultra models or something like that, right? But if we compare it to the Pro models, which again technically would be more competition to Apple's Pro models, right? The base variant of the iPhone still is relatively expensive. On the MacBook, while that is still true once you account for stuff like storage configurations, right? Apple can get away with it because their advantages in the desktop space are more unique, like fully sustained performance, even on battery, relatively powerful built-in GPU without the need for like a discrete GPU that makes your fans ramp up, high build quality, which is available in stuff like the Dell XPS devices and stuff like that, but usually Apple is still seen as kind of like the leader in that regard. And of course, just the advantages that people associate with Apple Silicon, like very reliable all-day battery life that will not drastically vary between tasks, a battery life that will not get killed by poor standby time, right? So and of course, like Apple's optimized apps and the integration into Apple's ecosystem. With the iPhone, Apple does not have as many advantages. I would still argue, of course, Apple has the Apple Watch and AirPods, and of course the Apple TV, Mac integration, everything, Apple Vision Pro at that point. But at least others are trying to replicate some of those advantages in the smartphone space. So Apple needs to be more hardware competitive there. While on the Mac side, it's really like, especially for people who really care about battery life, there is not that great of an alternative. Maybe now with Arrow Lake's like CPU chiplet being based on 3 nanometer, but that still leaves it open to all the Windows issues like insufficient and unstable standby time, things like that. Rosa saying hi. NMLV, if no OLED displays in 2025, it will be 10 years. Um, well, Apple went OLED on the iPhone 10 in 2017. Since Apple adopted an Apple Watch. Okay, Apple Watch was first, but the Apple Watch is a more unique example here. Very, very small screens, didn't even push like pixel density and stuff like that. Very large bezels at that point when even the Apple Watch originally launched. um, Plastic screen, like special LG supply. I'm more intent to be comparing the iPhone, because the iPhone is that like advanced Samsung screen, really competitive with everything else in the space. Yeah, but of course, now you're calling it 10 years of carrot dangling. I would fight back against that, because I do believe that the mini LED screens that Apple has implemented across iPad and the Mac are actually pretty fantastic, but we do know that like mini LED will be coming to an end. In a way, I was actually surprised that Apple gave us 1,000 nits of mini LED brightness this year, because I thought they would wait until tandem OLED came around and sell that as an advantage of tandem OLED over mini LED. Um, again, of course, I know OLED does have other advantage. NMLV, you're saying mini LED is 20-year-old tech. So is versions of OLED at that point. And if you compare like plasma, that one had its own like OLED like qualities. The point of mini LED is not like, also the density of mini OLED right now has nothing to do with the density of 20-year-old mini LED. The peak brightness levels on a small screen without like active cooling that you now get on mini LED has nothing to do with it. There was no IPS panel quality like display that you could actually connect to a mini LED backlight back in the day. So while I do understand what you mean, and believe me, I do want forward-looking tech. Like if you made me pay an arm and a leg right now for micro LED, I would be eating it up and gobbling it up like a goblin, I guess. But I don't want to disparage what Apple has achieved. In fact, I know this will be a hot take, but I've said it time and time again. I actually do prefer the color science of LCD screens versus OLED. Now, I do prefer the contrast of OLED, which obviously is fantastic, and in my opinion, and especially then the faster response times, in my opinion, pushes me. If brightness is about the same and I can get a decent longevity promise from an OLED panel, then I will choose OLED over like an LCD or mini LED screen, of course. But to me, I have always like, there are surprising amount of times where I just I just turn on my 14-inch M1 Max MacBook Pro and watch like an anime on it rather than my OLED TV. Yes, I did try some coloring stuff on my TV. It never looked as good, in my opinion, as LCD or LED. So again, however you want to put it, there are some advantages, there are some disadvantages. I wouldn't want OLED the way it's currently implemented on many like laptops on Apple, knowing like how much on my screen is like always on, like especially in the menu status bar on top. I just, and of course my dock down below and everything. Yeah, if you made me choose right now between regular OLED and mini LED on a larger screen, I would choose mini LED. And on my TV, yes, I would choose OLED because it's better for gaming and I don't game on my Mac. And if you made me choose between tandem OLED and mini LED, I would always choose tandem OLED. Yeah. You already have everything you mentioned in the Pro Display XDR. No, that's the point. The Pro Display XDR is not 120 hertz. The Pro Display XDR is ridiculously expensive. The Pro Display XDR needs active cooling. And the Pro Display XDR has only 576 local dimming zones, right? I believe we looked it up. XDR 576 dimming zones. I probably should write PDXDR, right? Yeah, the Pro Display XDR has 576 local dimming zones. Now, in comparison to that, MacBook Pro local dimming zones mini LED. Where is it? It's over 2,000, and I believe on the 16-inch it's over 2,500. But we had those numbers for the iPad Pro, and the density of the mini LED zones is very similar. And just you then get a larger screen. Guys, we have almost 20 people watching. Please hit the like button. Help us attract more people watching. Help us build a community that wants to get distracted today from the US election news. Just comment at me. Let me know what your thoughts are, what topics you would like to see discussed. Maybe you have some video you want me to react to. Yeah. Just maybe iPad Pro. Local dimming, okay, zones. Yeah, 2,500. So, and I believe that is what the iPad Pro. No, yeah, the 16-inch MacBook Pro has 2,500 dimming zones. So yeah, you absolutely cannot have that comparison. And yes, NMLV, I absolutely understand. OLED will have millions of dimming zones because it's literally pixel perfect. So for example, the MacBook Pro 16-inch would actually have almost 8 million dimming zones. I'm not denying that, but I do need the appropriate brightness with that, and I do need the peace of mind that I don't get burn-in. I know burn-in has gotten better on standard like OLED over time, and my iPhones have basically survived perfectly without burn-in, though my iPhone 13 Pro Max had a little bit of burn-in for the multitasking, what would you call it? The bar down below. So yeah, I absolutely understand it, and believe me, I do share your enthusiasm for like perfect contrast, super fast response time, and of course down the road, my ideal technology that is actually likely to find itself into consumer space is micro LED. Vanita Rethought joining and Vanina Rethought joining and saying Vanita. Okay, unfortunately I cannot do much with that, but welcome to the stream. So yeah, that is the technology that I'm most looking forward to. More similar to LED in some ways, but of course pixel perfect control similar to OLED, because it's not made out of organic light emitting diodes. It is going to be less susceptible to burn-in or over time degradation. Supposedly it even is more efficient and has has faster response time than OLED, but it obviously depends to which generation of OLED you're comparing to. OLED has improved even further beyond the already great stats that it was originally compared to micro LED. And we know that Apple has invested into micro LED development across, I believe, both LG and Samsung. Samsung builds like the wall right now where you combine a lot of panels into one giant one. But yeah, there is no real consumer product, unfortunately, right now with micro LED. It was rumored that the Apple Watch, similar how what you mentioned, NMLV, which is that the Apple Watch went OLED in 2015, 2 years before the iPhone did. It would be very interesting if the Apple Watch at some point was also the first to adopt micro LED. Tippomaster, I hope Apple hasn't put micro LED too far on the back burner. Yeah, there was a rumor that they basically are taking it slower, and that is a big reason why so many devices are getting OLED, especially now that for larger panels, they do have tandem OLED with bigger brightness, higher efficiency, lower risk of burn-in and stuff like that. So basically, tandem OLED, as good as it is, might actually be kind of like a stopgap solution, to use a word I really don't like using otherwise. Yeah, last I read was they canceled the Watch Ultra with it, I think. I wonder, like, sometimes we read that stuff, right? And my question is, what were the actual yields and what were the actual outcomes of that technology? Because one thing Apple cannot afford to do is launch a micro LED panel that is in ways inferior to the current generation of OLED. The first time they launch micro LED, it would have to be superior to regular OLED on iPhone, Apple Watch, etc., to tandem OLED once they launch it on like the iPad Pro and the MacBooks, right? So we don't know. Maybe they canceled it because they just didn't believe in the current state of micro LED development, and they went a little bit back to the drawing board and told themselves, "Oh, you know what? We actually do have like in between solutions that are already almost as good, have better supply chains, and might actually be in some ways cheaper to make." Now, of course, one thing that would be a lot cheaper to make, going back to the original rumor, would be Apple developing their own 90 hertz display tag for iPad Air, Studio Display, and iMac. I wouldn't be surprised if such a panel, if it made its way to the iPad Air, would also come to something like the MacBook Air, because those are pretty similar in like their adopted technology usually, but it isn't mentioned here. This is a rumor that was basically given to the Upgrade podcast by an anonymous source, so take that with a lot of salt, as saying, I have news on screen improvements for the next generation of the M3 iPad Air. So that's already questionable. Would Apple make the new iPad Air based on the M3 rather than like a highly binned M4? We know, for example, Apple now bins the M4 down to 8+8 cores. So 4 performance, 4 efficiency cores rather than 6, 8 GPU cores. Technically, they could go crazy on an M4 iPad Air and give us a 7 CPU core version, right? 3 P cores, 4 E cores would still be plenty fast, would make the binning extremely versatile. And it wouldn't look like, it would look surprisingly good for the iPad Air to have like 4 P cores. Whereas, of course, the iPad Pro comes with 3 P cores by default in the cheaper version, but all 6 E cores. So there, like, that's already a little bit of like, if not a red flag, then a little bit like an orange one. Apple is working on a higher refresh rate LCD, so no mini LED or anything crazy here. Liquid motion panel, liquid motion, okay. I mean, usually Apple calls it liquid retina, and liquid just refers to the fact that it has rounded corners. So no idea why it's worded that well. Maybe something is getting lost in maybe translation. Maybe that leaker has like something from a Chinese supplier or something like that. Fixed at around 90 hertz. Now, fixed does suggest to me two things. It's either, oh, that's the top refresh, or fixed means, in a technical sense, that it's not a variable refresh rate. So maybe you could switch between like 60 and 90 for efficiency. Maybe it could even have some dynamic adjustment for something like video watching, but it wouldn't do all the crazy 1 hertz adjustments that we have gotten used to, especially on like LTPO iPhones and something like that. They're also working on expanding it to other models or products like a 24-inch iMac or a next-gen studio display. Josephat saying, will OLED always have the energy efficiency benefit over micro? No. Actually, the earliest testing had shown that micro LED is more efficient than OLED. Don't know why. There's also the question of that micro LED would probably by default come with a perfect RGB matrix rather than like the pentile diamond matrices that we have seen in OLED. Supposedly that helps also with efficiency because every pixel is like a little bit more independent and stuff like that. And again, it will depend what you compare it to. Maybe the first gen micro LED panel down the road is in some ways worse than the most advanced OLED panels, but maybe at that point OLED has only like 10% more headroom, right? And micro LED can still get like 2-3 times better. I mean, imagine where we were with OLED. Like, for one, let's think even outside of Apple and think of AMOLED screens and like the original Galaxy S4 and Galaxy S5, right? Like where you had like 400 or 500 nits brightness levels. Then we had 600 nits brightness levels around when the iPhone 10 and Galaxy S8 and 9 came out. Then we started pushing to 1,000 nits. Now we have like the Apple Watch using a screen, the Apple Watch Ultra pushing up to 3,000 nits, right? So there's a lot of headroom in any technology. It just depends on if it has the research and development behind it. Relay 2K battery time when? Well, that depends on the question. Do you mean like, are we gonna discuss silicon carbide batteries again, which I have said time and time again is a technology that interests me, but I cannot tell you much what Apple will do with it down the road. Tippermaster, there might be confused because mini LED did take a lot more power. Yeah, mini LED is not micro LED. Not at all. Pixel level control just entirely changes how a screen works. Micro LED is independent, unlike backlit mini LED. Yes, NMLV, thank you for clarifying that to anybody who might not have known. Kev Chata, hi, what's new? Well, for me, I've already said it. Like, we've been streaming for about half an hour, and it helps me relax. Today, for me, going into tomorrow, there is the US election. I live in Germany, but I'm very bought into it because I care about a lot of world issues and stuff like that. So I'll probably not be able to sleep tonight. I've taken the day off tomorrow. So, I just wanted to make a streams, talk all about Apple, leaks, rumors, anything in the world of bigger world of tech, for example, even involving like the Snapdragon 8 Elite processor. So that's why we're coming together, discussing what we expect of new technology, the actual leaks and rumors of what we might get instead, because dreaming is free, but actual good display technology is not. So yeah, that's about the vibe you should expect from today's screen. Today's stream, not screen. I guess I've said screen so many times. Analyst Ross Young previously reported that the entire iPhone 17 lineup will feature promotion with up to 120 Hz refresh rate. Now, I don't know why this is mentioned here. Because quite honestly, this is not a rumor about the iPhone. For one, it's about LCD panels. So, plus it strongly implies that we are talking about a fixed panel, so not something with variable refresh rate like what LTPO would enable. Now, am I inclined to believe this rumor? Not really. I don't know what the LTPO LCD supply looks like. I still would like to see the iPad Air just adopt the screen that we had in like the 2017, 2018 iPad Pros. It's very clearly not so expensive, especially now with like the benefits of long-term supplies and logistics. Maybe Apple would want to go cheaper. Maybe LTPO, higher quality LCD, is basically ending supply because Apple was the only one ordering it. So it's like for the MacBook, and it was for the iPad Pro, but now the iPad Pro has gone tandem OLED. So I don't know. Maybe this is like a basically an overclocked 60 hertz standard LCD panel, but it's just a higher quality panel that can live with that overclock. And of course, we do know that panels are very, very capable of handling 90 hertz these days. Of course, in like the PC space, if you look even at VA panels and stuff like that, you can get 240 hertz, even 360 hertz or something like that. So I'm not saying that Apple is achieving some mind-blowing engineering benefit here. Maybe this would be more of a cost move than anything else. Um, we do have rumors about the next gen iPad Air that it would be coming next year and supposedly coming with a new Magic Keyboard. Maybe that's what it would align it with, but I doubt Apple would want to cannibalize any iPad Pro sales unless they use that to say like, oh, it goes from M2 to M4, it goes from 60 hertz to 90 hertz, right? Maybe that would be a reason for Apple to increase the pricing on the iPad Air after keeping it the same this year. But honestly, I couldn't tell you. It's one anonymous source. I just wanted to use this piece of rumor and leaks to honestly start the discussion that we had about like ideal display technology and what this device needs, what kind of refresh depending on what users use it. And I'm very happy we had some of those discussions. This could just be completely fake, right? Because obviously there's no substantiation here. I have no idea if that anonymous source already had leaked something to them and that's why it was like covered this way, or maybe it's just a juicy rumor and that's why the tech space reacted to it. So I'm not making any promises here, I'm not downplaying it, but as I put in my thumbnail, where I'm basically sighing, it's not something that I would build my excitement on for next generation products. Related to K, I heard Apple uses the same battery supply as other Chinese companies. At one point, the number game becomes too big of a difference. Yeah, like for example, was it Red Magic? Red Magic 8 Elite? I apologize. Everything comes up in German, no matter how many times I change that. So, there is supposedly like a phone coming with a full 7-inch screen and like a 7,000 milliampere hour battery. So, however you want to look at that, if that's enough for you. This is a gaming phone, of course, so it supports like a cooler and stuff like that. Um, we do have like stuff like Geekbench results for it, which is actually very interesting. I didn't know that. Um, so did they mention the oh yeah, and the 7,000 milliampere hour battery? So I would assume this is also a silicon carbide battery because the capacity is just too insane. Of course, the device itself is insane and it's very much geared towards like the size is utilized for the battery and like for this decent cooling for the chip. It does not have the best cameras, it does not have like the best haptics and stuff like that. So this device is very much a gaming phone, which doesn't interest me, but maybe some of you could be persuaded. Um, Sandro Gumperle, I've actually never seen your name here, but welcome to the chat. Will we see an updated studio display alongside the M4 Studio next year? I really hope so. I really hope that part of just like the delay, right, of like not getting the Mac Studio, as like we didn't get an M3 Mac Studio and M3 Mac Studio. Now we are supposedly getting an M4 Max and M4 Ultra Max Studio, but that will take like another 4 or 5 months or something like that. Even if it comes relatively early in something like March, which would surprise me. That's still a substantial gap. So I would hope that Apple finds something to make that that Mac Studio really better value, right? Because again, look at that studio display, right? At $15.99, you get a 5K 27-inch screen with 600 nits of brightness. Yes, you do get some unique stuff, like it has an A13 chip, it has decent speakers and microphones, so it's basically a very integrated solution. But it's not very an enthusiast solution, because while the speakers are nice, they will still suck in comparison to like a proper stereo setup. While the microphones are nice, they will still suck in comparison to like a pro mic, like my Shure MV7 Plus. And while the center stage camera is a fun camera, right, with all that adjusting and zooming, it will suck to compare it to even using like your iPhone through a continuity camera, which is what I do. So even for me, who never had an external screen, the value proposition of the studio display, now that I do have a very good standalone microphone, now that I do have that Belkin mount adapter, granted that's for the laptops ones, but it's easy to buy one for $30 for the desktop version. Like, what would be the benefit for me to get like a 220 ppi screen? That's nice. That scales well with what Apple does. I guess I could also stream very nicely 1440p content on it, right? But for everything else, like, it's not high refresh rate. It does not have any real HDR support. I believe it has like 7 dimming zones or something like that, right? Like, you wouldn't call them local dimming zones in the mini LED panel. It just has lights, like a standard LCD, and you're paying $1,600. Let's even look at lower market prices, around $1,400. Let's ignore nanotexture. $300 is a hefty upgrade price. But if you really need it, maybe it could be worth it. But then you also go like crazy, and Apple charges like $400 for a stand here. Like, for a better stand, I would understand it if that was the price of just the screen versus like no even then $400 is too much. Plus, it's only like tilt and height adjustable. It doesn't even have like pivot or whatever it's called, right? So that is absurd, in my opinion. This should probably be the standard, or like at the very most a 200 nit upgrade. So I have no idea what Apple was smoking when they did it. And I know that, again, similar to our discussions on like, oh, what's the price per gigabyte of storage, or what's the price of gigabyte per RAM? And obviously, Apple gives you the option here to get yourself like a nice $100 stand and just connect it via Visa mount adapter. But now you're killing some of the looks and the aesthetic that you would want from an all Apple solution. So I'm just very confused in why Apple chooses to like degrade the value proposition. Not because I don't know Apple, I know they like their profit margins, but I'm just curious on why they choose to effectively prevent people like me from paying that. I can afford $400 more, don't get me wrong. But if I want to pay $400 more for an accessory, that original accessory better be exceptional. For example, the Magic Keyboard, while yes, at $350, it's pretty overpriced, at least it connects to like a potentially amazing M4 iPad Pro, right? This is why I've always said that the iPad Air either needs a cheaper Magic Keyboard, or it needs like a $50 discount when you get it together on Apple's website. Otherwise, most people probably wouldn't think of getting the Magic Keyboard for its $600 or even $800 iPad Air. Um, and similar here. So, Joe, answer your questions, Sandro Gamperley, if I pronounced that correctly. I have no idea if a new studio display is coming. If all that studio gets is like 90 hertz, I guess it's better than not getting anything, but it still needs other improvements. Like, it arguably needs to be at the very least, like by default, like a 12.99 or something like that, maybe 13.99 at most, and that better stand that probably should be default should definitely not be a $400 upcharge. um, Relay 2K, everyone and their mother is using 6,000 milliampere hours now. Yes, and this is a discussion that will be ultimately overturned, right? Over time, Apple will have 5,000 nits plus on a Pro Max device. But as I say, Apple does have other priorities, both cost and size wise. Plus, Apple does achieve very nice battery life even with their smaller battery capacities. But we've had that discussion in the past when the iPhone had like 1600 milliampere hours, and we started getting competitors with 2500 or 3000 milliampere hours, right? When Apple was still having like that 4-inch iPhone, and even the 4.7-inch iPhone 6 didn't really upend like Apple's battery capacity problem, but still the iPhone 6 was an incredibly popular generation. The iPhone 6 Plus had around 3,000 milliampere hours, which was comparable to some of the competitors. Some had started getting around 3,500. A very few had like 4,000. So you would see a similar like 25 to 33% gap to what we're seeing now. That being said, Apple didn't care, and with the iPhone 6s Plus, when they introduced 3D Touch, they actually slightly reduced the battery capacity because they were like, oh, you know what? We actually want to give users like a new feature. We do have more cost from using like a new aluminum alloy. You know what? We don't maybe need all the battery capacity of last year. Obviously, they did, and later they did then improve battery capacity again on the iPhone 7 Plus. But this is the game that Apple plays because they do not advertise battery capacity, they do advertise battery life. And because they do believe that most people are fine with the battery life on most iPhones across the board, they do not feel the need to go all too crazy on capacity. Sandra saying, let's see if Gurman, Ross Young, and or Minchi Kuo will comment on the 90 hertz rumor anytime soon. Yeah, I wonder if like I wonder if Ross Young would comment on something like that relatively quickly. I mean, he has like that subscriber Twitter thing, right, where people pay him money to respond to messages relatively quickly. I don't do that, but maybe somebody else does, and it becomes a piece of news relatively quickly. Kev Chatta, I almost get tempted with MacBook Air 13-inch M2, 8 gigs, 256 gigabytes as a short term. It was $650. Yeah, I've seen some like, basically like, I don't know in your country, right? But in the US, it was Best Buy. Here in Germany, we have like sites like Cyberport that are now doing a lot of clearance because I imagine not many people would want to pay top dollar for 8 gigabyte of RAM max these days now. And yeah, I've seen, especially in the US, such crazy stuff because obviously the US price also doesn't have the value added tax included. So yeah, I fully understand that. Relay, I'm gonna get a base M1 if M2, M3 don't become cheaper by March. That's also a very smart decision. I've talked about it with a friend who still has an Intel MacBook Pro, but it serves her relatively well up until this point. And she was like, you know what? Like, it's real. The tech is really good. I've heard so much about Apple Silicon. I don't need the highest end, and now the RAM value proposition is better. And I'm like, yeah, you should look into that. And then she looked at the actual like retail prices and was relatively high. So I was really trying to tell her, by the time the M4 MacBook Air comes out, which probably could be where you would look at it, Relay, right? If you're saying by March, that should put the pricing, especially of the M2 version, substantially lower. as Apple stopped selling the M2 officially, so they stopped making the M2. So a lot of stores would just be inclined to get rid of it as quickly as possible. I assume the M3 MacBook Air just takes the spot of the M2 version. Maybe Apple even does something crazy like keeping the M2 version, but not the M3. Because obviously we do know that Apple kind of wants to go away from N3B production from TSMC. So there is a lot that could happen, but I think regardless what happens, we do know one thing, and that is that older devices will be cheaper. Refurbished devices will be a lot cheaper, maybe not through Apple's website, but if you go through like Amazon or something like that, you might find yourself like a laughable price. And of course, if you're willing to go with an 8 gig device, right, which would obviously predate now like anything that is getting produced from here on forward, this is where you could get like $700 and below for even M2, and I would guess like $800 and below for M3. And Angelica, one of our MarkTech Pro Max supporters, joining, saying it's nice to join after the workday, to relax and to enjoy the stream. Wishing us a lot of success. There won't be too much success here. As I said, this is a distraction stream, but thank you still so much for joining. Thank you so much, guys, for contributing to the live chat, just keeping me energized. The Coke is doing its part. Let me drink some water so the Coke just doesn't take over my body and I just sit there like releasing gas all the time. But I guess this is the display portion here. It's not a crazy rumor. It's not a well-substantiated rumor, but I do think it warranted a discussion about the displays, the current state of pricing, depending on which display is built in and stuff like that. So thank you so much for enabling that kind of talk. So that also gives me the option to close that up, which I just opened. Which brings us to a few quick shot rumors. First of all, the tvOS 18.2 beta adds support for 21:9 and other aspect ratios. This was promised by Apple in line with WWDC and what they talked about tvOS 18. This is, of course, primarily built for projectors because projectors of course, do support like variable even aspect ratios, but even, of course, screens, right? And Apple gives you quite a lot of choice from like 21:9 to actually the more correct like differentiation of 2.37 to 1, 2.39 to 1, 2.4 to 1. So a lot of respect to whoever built it, like was really like apparently like a cinema format aficionado and knew that some projectors could like interpret that like exact ratio slightly differently. Then we have the real 4K standard. DCI 4K is 1496 by 2160. So that's obviously higher and wider than the 3840. Technically, like a lot of movies would be like designed for that. So if you actually have a projector that displays beyond regular 16:9 4K, that's cool. And you have ultra crazy, ultra wide 32:9. I guess this is ultra wide because technically 21:9 is already ultra wide because 16:9 is already wide. So yeah, if you are a projector guy and you always like the versatility and the performance of Apple TV, now those two are a better combo than ever. But don't forget, this is a beta. So you would have to expect, of course, some potential issues that come with that. To me, I use betas right now on all my devices, ranging from my iPhone, iPad, MacBook Pro, Apple TV, Apple Watch. So I have not had bad issues with like the 18 betas. But yeah, if you might have like a crucial workflow, which probably doesn't apply to the Apple TV, but maybe you have kids, like young kids, that would get angry if you have to do a lot of troubleshooting on the Apple TV at some point, maybe consider just waiting for the official TV OS 18.2 release. But that is cool. While I won't benefit from it, I've heard some people who are in the projector user market basically be very, very excited about it. And that brings me right away to another rumor, actually not rumor, to another beta release, and actually something that is related to aspect ratios, and that is the killer feature of Apple Vision Pro right now, and that is the support for wide and ultra wide modes. Now, again, you could also call it wide, ultra wide, and ultra wide, because that mode is 30, I believe it's 32 by 9, or however crazy it is. Um, so basically, in standard mode, you were just gonna like get your Mac screen right output with the regular resolution inside Apple Vision Pro. But now you can expand your Mac screen to be like more of like an ultra wide panel, like a 21 by 9, or you can go all the way crazy, basically having three screens by side integrated into one. And that I've heard from people who actually have Vision Pro, it does seem game changing. Now, again, I do understand $3,500 base price. If you want the 1 terabyte model, close to 4K just in USD, way beyond that if you're like in Europe or something like that. So I fully understand why it won't get people to necessarily buy the first generation Vision Pro. But imagine if a Vision Air, right, a cheaper Apple Vision device, does basically have most of Apple Vision Pro's capabilities, and of course the support for features like that. But it then costs $1,500 or $1,800 or even a full $2,000. But at that point, it's just much more affordable. Let's say they get rid of eyesight at the front, which is an easy way to save money. They switch a lot of materials from aluminum to plastic, reducing weight, making it more comfortable to wear. Even if the screen is lower pixel density than it is right now, there are still improvements that Apple could make that wouldn't really add cost. For example, like a wider field of view, they would just have to make the mask sit a little differently on your face. So yeah, while Apple Vision Pro 2 is rumored for 2025, then to come with an M5 processor, at that point I also assume that the use of a Wi-Fi 7 module could potentially like make all of this even higher resolution, even lower latency and things like that. But for now, everything that I hear is just that this is the best external but actually very internal screen that you can use. There's basically no, what is a doorstep effect or something like that, like where you can see the pixels and stuff like that. So yeah, while again it won't make me buy an Apple Vision Pro, it definitely looks appealing. And if you are somebody for whom the Apple Vision Pro is comfortable, if you can afford it, of course. Now, granted, in November 2024, I probably wouldn't like motivate you to buy the original Apple Vision Pro. Certainly not at full price. Maybe you can buy it on like eBay or something. Some people buy like Apple Vision Pro, use it for a day or a week, and just sell it because it's just not for them. Or at the very least, they use it like for 3 or 4 weeks, and now they're outside the return window to Apple, and now they sell it, right? Maybe some people have like small cracks for eyesight and whatever, but it's not something that bothers you. Maybe that is a consideration for you. So yeah, not saying you should, or definitely not that you must buy the Apple Vision Pro because of that feature, but it's definitely a cool feature, and it's definitely something that I would enjoy using like a lot. Guys, hit the like button. Help us attract more people. Help distract me. Help me distract you. Let's make this enjoyable for everyone. Let's go through Apple leaks, rumors, everything in between. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, share the video to anybody who you think might enjoy it. Comment live. Make this a very lively live stream for us. Give me your opinions. Give me your questions. Give me your topic suggestions. And of course, if you want to support this channel and my beating heart directly, leave a super chat as a small donation right here in the live chat, or consider becoming a channel member here on YouTube or a supporter over on Patreon. All support goes a long way, gets reinvested right into the channel. So if you can do it, that is very much appreciated. That ends this portion of beta talk. Now, this is very near and dear to my heart. Unfortunately, I do not have that because I do not have the Apple News app here in Germany. But if you do, you can have a live activity and monitor here the US election, seeing who is getting the Senate, who is getting the House, who is getting the electoral college votes. So I just wanted to give, if you're somebody like me and is very anxious about all of that and just you want the news as digestible as possible, you probably don't want to nonstop watch like CNN or MSNBC or BBC or whatever channel you have in your country. Seems like a good in-between solution. It still allows you to basically doom scroll. You would have to turn on your screen time and time again, or keep it, I guess, on AOD, and then it's still somewhat visible. But that was just funny to me, and thank you, Tim Hardwick, for covering that. But yeah, for me, at least in Germany, that feature doesn't work. Speaking of Apple Vision Pro, before that, Apple is having apparently internal polls or surveys about smart glasses inside the company. They're basically asking them, like, what's the current state of the technology? What would you be interested in, right? If you use something like that, right? So, granted, they could be asking that anyone, but they probably are happy to get like the input of like engineers and software developers, because they would be like, oh, I know this actually, right? Oh, it actually would interest me to develop for something like what was it called, like Meta's Orion glasses or the Ray-Ban glasses and something like that, which I guess it's all Meta at this point. So if you're somebody who's really holding out for like the holy grail of augmented technology, augmented reality technology to be smart glasses like that, you probably would have to wait quite a bit. Like Meta's Orion glasses cost like 10K to make. So even if that technology comes to the actual consumer, I assume Facebook would still try to subsidize it heavily, but don't expect it to cost like below 2K anytime soon. We've seen at what price they wanted to sell like the Meta Quest Pro with like a screen that technically isn't that great of a solution for virtual reality. So, again, there is a chance that at some point Apple will be giving us smart glasses like that. But given the kind of experimental state of that technology, I wouldn't be very like excited in the near-term future. Let's put it like that. More beta features talk, actually very interesting. Apple is, I have to say, together with all the Apple Intelligence features across iOS 18.1 and now iOS 18.2, I myself have now Apple Intelligence on my Mac. Here's a brief preview. Yeah, okay. I just wanted to show that like Apple's software like efforts this year are actually very, very ambitious. Like I know at this point there's the operating systems are very mature. It's hard to add actually like game changing things, but I do believe that Apple is doing quite a good job of offering something that like maybe deep down a lot of people actually thought they need it but didn't verbalize it. So over time Apple keeps adding stuff, like for example what we discussed with Vision OS wide, ultra wide monitor support for Macs. Now with iOS 18.2 they add a new Find My option. So for example, if like your AirTag is connected to your luggage or is inside your luggage, you can actually share the permission to locate it with like the airline that was overseeing your luggage that maybe lost your luggage. So that's very good. That way you don't have to like send them silly screenshots or something like that, or God forbid actually get there with your iPhone. So there's a lot of good stuff inside 18.1, 18.2. It seems like I don't know if Apple really increased their engineering like developer teams, but it seems like iOS 18 and the other releases this year are actually quite ambitious. Now, again, some people are still asking for a full redesign. Quite honestly, after all the effort that Apple is now putting into making like dark mode icons, I'm not sure how interested they are in redesigning the icons, at least before iOS 20. Like, I don't see Apple adding like dark mode icons and like a redesigned settings app with new glyphs at least inside iOS 18, and then iOS 19 comes along. Oh, now we had to change every app icon with it, every dark mode version and something like that. So, and the control center is new. Maybe at some point Apple could make changes to the notification center and lock screen. But the customization inside this is actually still pretty new, was added in like iOS 16. So, however you want to see it, there is a lot that's still happening, but it's quality of life features, right? It's smaller features. We just talked about like potentially features that would jump right into your face, right? Like higher refresh rate screens, mini LED, tandem OLED, micro LED screen, something like that, or even something that is very, of course, on a hardware basis, really easy to understand. It's like, oh, faster processors, something like that, or in the software sense, very easy to see, oh, the control center is redesigned. But actually, when you look into individual apps, features inside even a system like Siri, there is a lot happening. There must be a lot happening. For example, Siri was very far behind the competition, but in my opinion, Apple is still improving features where they were already ahead of the competition. So Find My getting that option definitely is some cool stuff. Apple is also in the latest iOS 18.2 beta fulfilling a promise that they made during the announcement of the iPhone 16. So that's for devices that do have camera control, which includes the iPhone 16, 16 Plus, 16 Pro, 16 Pro Max. So you can now add focus and exposure lock to Control Center. You can also like enable or disable that feature inside the settings app. I believe there's also like a customization toggle for how quick you want camera control to work when you configure it to a double tap. So adding customization to a feature that some people have called a gimmick, some people have called poorly thought out, that the button is poorly placed, that it makes the device shake a little when you click because the button is it does protrude ever so slightly, but not enough, right? When you compare it to something like the power button. So obviously you need that deeper press and that makes the device shake. I'm very inclined to think that maybe next year we will actually see a small camera control redesign. So when I buy my 17 Pro Max, I wouldn't be surprised if we get a more intuitive camera control with actually the same user interface and stuff, but maybe the button itself gets like a small hardware change. I wouldn't be surprised about that. Because Apple does listen to stuff like that. Sometimes they can be stubborn, like they did try to redesign the butterfly keyboard twice, basically, but ultimately they went back to traditional scissor switches, and unless they are similarly stubborn with camera control, I wouldn't be surprised if camera control becomes more of a protruding button that is a little bit more like Sony's manual camera shutter. Um, so the new feature must be enabled in the camera settings app. Once enabled, users can lightly press and hold camera control to lock both focus and exposure in the current settings. I assume that's very good. Like if you have like a person or something in it, and maybe you will move like your phone a little bit around to get like the perfect angle, but you don't want exposure or something to change during it. So it's not a crazy setting. Obviously, that's something you would want to have, especially if you're really desperately trying not to use the touch screen for some reason. But yeah, it's definitely good that Apple is adding features that they had promised during their initial reveal. Also, camera control by itself is becoming more useful with the add-on of visual intelligence. Visual intelligence relies on Google, like reverse image search, or ChatGPT's like I guess visual intelligence, you could say. Maybe down the road, Apple will handle more stuff by themselves. They do handle some stuff by themselves, like the actual like text recognition on it, but they do then refer to Google or or OpenAI's ChatGPT to actually analyze what's on screen. So yeah, definitely. Like I know a lot of people said camera control is a little bit of a gimmicky button, but in my opinion, we have a highly customizable button with the action button. We of course do have the power button that gives you all the goodies of like a long press for Siri, a double click for like credit card stuff, triple click for accessibility, and of course just on off. We have the volume buttons, which are very nice, very clicky, and you can even use them as like shutter buttons if the camera app is open. And of course, you do now have the volume control button. You can configure it to like a click or a double click. You can also set it up for third-party apps. So if maybe you're happy with accessing Apple's camera app by just swiping on the lock screen, or maybe you configure it to the action button, and maybe you're a really big user of like Halite or something like that, or maybe you want like a video app for that, like something like Blackmagic's professional app. That definitely makes it very, very usable. Plus all those swipe controls, now the ability to set a focus and exposure locks, and the use of it for visual intelligence by long pressing the button. All that I think is missing is the ability to give a secondary feature to the action button with a double click. Maybe Apple doesn't like giving it double click because it's such a small freaking button, which makes it obviously a lot easier to just long press on it. But it definitely would be a cool feature. Plus, for anybody who wants even more shortcuts, I guess, you also, of course, have the option to, on the lock screen, configure those two software buttons so they're no longer locked to camera and flashlight. Mine is, for example, set to flashlight and silent mode. And of course, you have like double tap or triple tap on the back, which you can configure in your settings. And that gives you now a lot of ways to add shortcuts, accessibility settings, opening up certain apps, enabling or disabling certain control center features and stuff like that. So yeah, while we can argue if camera control is a very well-made button or not, it's definitely good that Apple is going the more buttons route. So many Android phones these days have like a volume up, volume down, and a power button. So the fact that Apple has two extra buttons over that, and with double and triple tap on the back, even more buttons, so it is actually quite cool. Now, of course, Apple has missing out over the years to just implement the camera into the power button. I have no idea why triple click never gave us the option to configure to the camera. But now, obviously, if you have an iPhone 16, 16 Plus, 16 Pro, or 16 Pro Max, camera control, don't call it a button, gives you a lot of the things that people were asking for. And speaking of betas, that's kind of the last beta talk I have for you today. This is the ChatGPT integration inside iOS 18.2 becomes more concrete. So in that case, you can now actually configure it to your ChatGPT account. What's good about it is you can also log in through Google or through Apple sign in and stuff like that. So if you don't necessarily want to give OpenAI all your data and stuff like that, or even your email, there are some workarounds. But primarily, this does exist to give you the option to add ChatGPT Plus. You would be paying like around $20 a month. Varies a bit by the region and stuff like that. Apple would obviously get to keep a portion of that. You would also be able to use that in the ChatGPT app. For example, there is a ChatGPT app on macOS that is very well integrated. There's an iOS ChatGPT app that is pretty well made. I've heard some people complain that like, oh, they're nickel and diming you, and I'm like, no. Like, what were you thinking? What would happen? The entire point of what ChatGPT currently is inside of the broader Apple Intelligence umbrella is the same thing as how search engines are integrated into Safari. Apple doesn't control what the other people. I mean, they can obviously control how much data you give to something through Safari, right, or through system APIs. And with ChatGPT or any other large language model that you would integrate into like into the an OS level, right? They can control, oh, do they automatically get your data or do you ask anytime? This is why they do have something like confirm ChatGPT requests. So it would literally ask you every time it tries to contact ChatGPT, right? Give them your prompt, give them potentially an image to analyze or something like that, or you turn it off, and that way it's a little bit more seamless. I still think that for images and stuff like that, it will always ask you, but for a more basic prompt, you can basically disable it. But you are getting the basic ChatGPT experience, which means you would have a daily limit of ChatGPT prompts. You wouldn't get access necessary to all the crazy features. For example, like their more advanced voice mode that they just added to ChatGPT 4.0 and something like that. Obviously, for that, you would kind of need their app anyway, and then you would need to pay extra. But I guess this way, you can just get that payment very quickly over it. Plus, over time, this won't just be ChatGPT. There will be support for potentially Microsoft's Copilot, which is based on ChatGPT anyway, or for something based on Google Gemini, or a version of Claude or something like that. And all of them potentially could offer you a paid upgrade path, because they do have limited bandwidth, and Apple is not going to pay each and every company hundreds and millions or even billions of dollars to give every potential iOS and macOS and iPadOS user unlimited prompts on their most advanced large language model. That's just not how it happens. Apple already pays to companies like to like satellite companies to make sure that you get like free satellite connectivity. That's a few $billion and something like that. Apple is not gonna add cost upon cost upon cost with every new software feature they add. They already are paying for research and development for their own large language models. They themselves don't actually plan on charging you for using any of their stuff for years to come. They also have to build out their private cloud compute servers. So if you're somebody who thought, oh man, maybe like Apple goes the ChatGPT route and even builds like their own search engine or something like that, I just don't think so. I think private cloud compute will just be the way to access Apple's larger large language models, the ones that are too large to run on device, the one that might actually want to at any time aggregate all your like iCloud data for more complex prompts and stuff like that. But for search engine general knowledge like capabilities, similar to how Apple doesn't have their own search engine inside Safari, this will be where the other large language models exist, and you will potentially be paying extra for them, and a part of that revenue will be going to Apple, which will help them finance their own AI efforts. So to anybody who's complaining about that, I just don't know what some people were expecting. I'm not saying it's fantastic to not get ChatGPT everything for free, but you also have to just think realistically. That was never going to happen unless it was like a completely exclusive deal for ChatGPT. But at that point, Apple could potentially get into trouble with stuff like the European Commission again. So instead, it will be a very broad approach. It will allow alternative language models to be supported. And it will allow you to purchase more premium versions of those solutions. So that about ends the beta talk for today. I know a lot of you like keep up to date on those issues anyway, but a lot of it was like announced yesterday, so I thought it just made sense to mention it. It was surprising that given like daylight time in the US, the Switch, and of course, the fact that today is US election, Apple still found time yesterday to release so many new betas, but they did. There was a lot of fun new stuff in there to analyze, and I was very happy to provide you with that very brief, quick analysis. Now, this is actually not a super comprehensive thing because I am still waiting for like a lot of deep dives into the real world performance of the Snapdragon 8 Elite. This is drama that has been brewing for a little while. We, of course, know that the Snapdragon 8 Elite, which was originally dubbed the Snapdragon 8 Gen 4, so this is coming to a broad range of flagship Android devices. It's the most expensive Snapdragon chip ever made. It's actually forcing some devices to downscale other features, like potentially give you a slightly smaller main camera module or something like that, because they do have to invest not only in the very expensive Snapdragon 8 Elite, but the cooling system to provide for it and the necessary battery capacity to power it for like a decent period of time. And one of those devices that has been tested here by Android Authority is the Realme 7, what is it called? The Realme GT7 Pro. This is mostly for the Indian market. And they call their first interactions with that Snapdragon 8 Elite phone a hot mess. And they're even accusing them of benchmark manipulation, which is important. This is referring to Realme, and I believe Realme is the smaller brand of Oppo. Realme owner. Yeah, it's Oppo owns OnePlus and Realme, right? And Realme is OnePlus is basically their Western brand, but premium, and Realme is basically their cheaper brand, and Oppo is their main, primarily Chinese brand, but they do still sell regular Oppo devices across the world. So whether or not that means it applies to all of Oppo, that remains to be seen. But definitely their cheaper Realme device, which it will have like less cooling and stuff like that. So it might be more in need of something like benchmark manipulation. So what you're getting on paper, they're briefly recapping the specs here. Of course, one thing we've discussed on this channel are the high clock speeds, especially on the 2 prime cores going up to 4.32 gigahertz. If anything on the 8 Elite is causing issues, in my opinion, that is that clock speed. We've seen how much power, for example, the X Elite, which is based on an older 4 nanometer node, but still there is not such a big gap between N4P and N3E. How much it struggles with efficiency at like 4.2 gigahertz. To see even higher clock speeds on N3E in a smartphone was always a little concerning. I'm not saying it's impossible. Obviously, for example, like that crazy, like what Red Magic phone or whatever, and the latest ROG gaming phones, they will probably deal with it quite nicely. But especially if you're looking at this and you're like, oh my God, Samsung already struggled with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3. This is definitely not more efficient at peak. It is more efficient throughout the performance curve, but if you are giving it one 1 gigahertz higher clocks, you will pay for that with power consumption. Plus, there is the rumor that the Galaxy S25 Ultra is not getting the larger battery capacity that some Chinese phones are getting. For example, Relay, you mentioned that a lot of companies are going 6,000 plus milliampere hours on their flagship smartphones. That is not the rumor for the Galaxy S25 Ultra, which is rumored to be getting thinner. And of course, it's still keeping their S Pen. So there, plus of course the cost of the 8 Elite in general, there's just not much room, be it in cost or in literal room inside the device, to add like a larger battery. Especially not without potentially resulting in like a Galaxy Note 7 like fiasco. Especially considering thermal issues that could come up with the use of like such a flagship chip. Plus, it's rumored that they might be using an even higher clocked 8 Elite, like an 8 Elite for Galaxy. So, yeah. Again, we are talking here about the Realme, but it just made me automatically think of what Samsung would have to offer next year. And I just think that Samsung's potential next year in markets like India for like ultra flagships will just suck. And the fact that people are talking like that the Galaxy S26 series, for example, will not have the smaller models anymore, that to me makes sense because those are really not competitively priced at all, especially if another rumor turns out to be true, which we'll talk about later. Realize, so basically Snapdragon is good for moderate use and nothing too high. Well, it's still good for high usage. I wish they would let you like potentially lock down clock speeds to like, let's say even just like 4.15 gigahertz or something like that, because we've seen, for example, with the Dimensity 9400 on the performance efficiency curve by Geekervan, that you get still like 90% of performance by just reducing, but you reduce power consumption by almost 50%. So I imagine if you reduce maximum performance by like 5 or 7%, you could reduce power consumption, peak power consumption, by like 40, 50%, something like that. Yeah, it just pushes it so far outside the efficiency window. Even if it's just a 20% power reduction, that would make the big difference between like sustained performance and non-sustained performance. Yeah, that's how I see it. I wonder how Geekervan got their data. Geekervan has root level access, so I believe they actually can change the clock speeds on their devices. This is why on the iPhone they usually have like 2 points, right? They don't have a full graph because on the iPhone they just have like regular access, and then they, I believe, do some side loading to get apps like Spec 2017 testing onto the device. But in general, all they do is still rely on like regular iOS. So they cannot change clock speeds, they cannot create like custom efficiency modes or something like it. While on the Android side, some manufacturers, in fact I believe most these days, just give them like really deep system access, so they just can like give you a full clock speed efficiency curve, which again is not perfect because don't forget there are technically different cores on the device, right? Like 2 prime cores and what they call 6 performance cores, even though they are relatively seen as efficiency cores in comparison to the prime cores. Yeah, this is why Geekervant's testing for Android, in my opinion, is more correct than their well, their testing for iOS is correct. I would say some of their conclusions for iOS, they're treating it as if they have the same amount of data for iOS as they do for Android, and they clearly don't, because they don't have the deep system level access. So this is why I see them as a very good potential reviewer for Android related stuff, and a decent one for Apple related stuff, if that makes sense. Of course, on Mac, they do have more freedoms, but that's a different discussion. So what happened? The Snapdragon 8 Elite phone couldn't finish stress test. I started out running the phone through 3D Mark's GPU stress test to give us, by the way, anybody who uses 3D Mark's GPU stress test and they use like still like Wildlife Extreme, I just want to kill them. Like, use Solar Bay, or even better, use Steel Nomad Lite. Solar Bay seems like a very lazy ray tracing benchmark that was just hastily put together. It just isn't really ray tracing intensive. And we've seen how Apple is like super competitive with like lower power RTX and AMD GPUs when it comes to ray tracing. Because obviously Apple doesn't make 120 watt SoCs. And what's weird is that by the logic of the Solar Bay test, it would mean that Apple, which is competitive to like RTX ray tracing but inferior, and actually way better than AMD's ray tracing, and actually better than even Intel's ray tracing, which is also very good for integrated solutions. That would mean that by the logic of Solar Bay, Android devices with the Dimensity 9400 and especially the Snapdragon 8 Elite are actually way superior to even like RTX when it comes to raster ratio to RT performance. So Solar Bay, I just don't trust that test too much. But not saying that it's bad. I'm just saying that I would be very surprised if there was actually like a 40% performance difference in like ray tracing between like the 18 Pro and the 8, even the 8 Gen 3 even. So let's see what they were talking about. Unfortunately, the Realme GT7 Pro killed the 3D Mark app midway through our 3 tests, which include Wildlife Stress Test, Wildlife Extreme Stress Test, and Solar Based Stress Test. Again, like, why not Steel Nomad Lite? It's so much better. The phone was uncomfortably hot at this point, and it displayed heat-related warnings upon shutting down the app. Now, again, this could be very indicative of a pre-production problem. Maybe it's a problem with software, maybe even with like a not fully finished piece of hardware. It's definitely a little disconcerting, but I'm not saying this will obviously be the problem for all 8 Elite tests. It would be weird if other devices wouldn't just at least like throttle their performance like crazy, but still finish the test and instead decide to kill the actual application. The device also briefly limited me to only using a few apps, allowing me to make calls and very little else. Yeah, that makes sense. Those are like emergency features for like overheating devices. So you would still be able to call somebody if you're stranded in the desert. Really, isn't Realme and Xiaomi kind of bad with thermal management? With Xiaomi, it's different because Xiaomi, they do not have the largest vapor chamber heat sinks, but Xiaomi is aggressive in throttling peak performance, but then trying to sustain as much of that limited performance as possible. I'll get to that. I actually have some data from great guys like DameTech on Twitter, who will probably also turn a lot of that in the video, but for now he hasn't, so I have to cover it in a different way. But yeah, there are problems, and Realme definitely suffers here from for one, they do probably have the least impressive cooling system out of any 8 Elite device. To be quite honest, a device like the GT7 Pro should probably have waited until a product like the Snapdragon 8S Elite, basically like a lower clocked version, even a smaller dedicated die, and something like that. And then it would be cheaper to make, and it would give you a more stable user experience. So, what else happened to that writer at Android Authority? Which it does not give me the name of the author. Okay. I just wanted to refer to them by their name. Uh, I tried switching from the default balance performance mode to the phone's power saving mode, but this didn't make a difference. The 3D Mark app still shut down due to excessive heat. Data collected during this failed runs reveals that the phone hit a toasty peak of 46 degrees Celsius. We will actually see how some phones are very comfortably going beyond that. This is deeply concerning. I decided to run a disguised version of 3D Mark to bypass any possible benchmark optimizing shenanigans on Realme's part, using the balance profile once again. I was finally able to complete the 3 stress tests, revealing a stability of 68.7, 66.7, and 64.3 respectively. The graphs below showed, by the way, this is why I don't encourage running these tests, because they do, even on a device that is obviously thermally limited, show above 60% stability. Above 60% stability on a smartphone is not terrible. I would argue that over 70 or over 75% is actually quite good, and everything over 80% is quite honestly great. Obviously, for 100%, that's more where we're talking about actively cooled devices. But if he ran like Steel Nomad Lite, I wouldn't be surprised if that stability jumped below 50%, because that is actually a test that is very demanding on the device. The graphs below showed that the phone suffered steep performance drops at first and then delivered rock-solid stability from roughly midway through. This stable performance wasn't on par with peak S24 Ultra scores, but the Realme phone still maintained a healthy performance advantage on every run. So definitely you can see that even on, granted, the S24 Ultra is also a thermally limited product. I don't know what they did with that vapor chamber that was supposed to be like 60% larger than on the Galaxy S23 Ultra. By the way, there is a misconception about vapor chambers, and people believe that vapor chambers just make up the entire cooling capacity. The Galaxy S24 Ultra does not have 60% more thermal mass than the S23 Ultra. It does have a larger vapor chamber that helps it dissipate the heat faster and over a broader area. But when you look at like the aluminum that's built into like inside the chassis for stability and thermal reasons, when you look at the titanium around the product, which is terrible for heat dissipation, when you look at the glass on the back, which again is terrible for heat dissipation, those are all in some ways bottlenecks. They are also like more thermal headroom technically, but just bad materials for it. So when people think like some people badmouth the S24 Ultra saying, oh, how can the 8 Gen 3 sometimes be less stable on the S24 Ultra than the 8 Gen 2 was on the S23 Ultra? Well, that's because a larger vapor chamber isn't magic. If you don't connect that vapor chamber to more copper, to more aluminum, and don't allow it a good path to dissipate the heat. I don't know what Samsung's exact like glass materials are. Maybe they are very bad for thermals or something like that. I know titanium is worse for thermals than aluminum, so that's part of why the S24 Ultra will have some issues in comparison to the S23 Ultra. But yeah, this is what I'm trying to say. Vapor chambers are good. They're definitely better than not having vapor chambers, but they're not magical panacea. And whenever somebody says, oh, our vapor chamber is 50, 60% larger, they don't actually mean that the thermal mass of the entire device is 50, 60% higher. The phone was hot to the touch after the successful test too. In fact, the app reported a peak temperature of 45 degrees Celsius in wildlife stress test, which was 2 to 3 degrees, which I assume that would mean it would be way above 50 degrees for something like Steel Nomad Lite, unless it just decided to kill the test. which was 2 to 3 degrees higher than Google Pixel 9 Pro XL and S24 Ultra's peak temperatures. Oddly enough, the GT7 Pro's temperature in the two other stress tests was pretty much in line with those of Google and Samsung phones. Okay. Check out the graph below, which compares the Realme and Samsung phones. This shows that the Galaxy phone was actually hotter than the Snapdragon 8 Elite handset until the halfway point. The Samsung phone's temperatures then stabilized, and we got some very minor performance wobbles. Meanwhile, the Realme handset delivers extremely stable performance, but sees gradually rising temperature that will take it well past the S24 Ultra. I'm concerned that long-term gaming sessions might come to a premature end on this hardware if the titles aren't optimized by the OEM or chip maker. Once again, bear in mind that this test used a spoofed and cooler running. Okay, I didn't know that this version was cooler running version of the 3D Mark app. This is why, like, I'm just so confused by some 3D Mark stuff. This behavior made me wonder about our CPU benchmarks as well, so we installed a spoofed version of Geekbench 6 to determine if Realme was indeed turning up the wick when it detects benchmark apps. The results showed that single-core and multi-core performance dropped by a massive 63 and 47% respectively compared to the standard Geekbench app. So, like, this is real world performance accessible to a benchmark app versus any other app, right? This is why I'm trying to tell you, like, don't get fooled by, oh, the 8 Elite is so fast. Don't get me wrong, it is fast and it's likely getting implemented pretty well in like ambitious devices like the OnePlus 13, the Xiaomi 15, especially the Ultra down the road and something like that. But if you think that you are getting anywhere close to the performance you're getting in benchmarks, because part of what Apple does, Apple really wants you to use the power, not fully sustained, but at least in peaks, like in browser stuff and any other app, right? They design their own processors, right? They would be so much better off if they could give you a 20-25% smaller die, knowing that, oh, you cannot utilize those peak speeds anyway, so why would we even build them, right? Like, I know some people have like this idea that Geekbench is like super like Apple conspiratorially optimized and shit like that, but that's not true. Geekbench just happened over time to be a popular benchmark app. But when you test, for example, Cinebench on the Mac, M4 shows similar gains over other architectures in Cinebench 2024, and Cinebench R23, just last year's version, was still crap optimized for Apple's architectures. So who knows, maybe next year the gap in Cinebench could be larger than the gap in Geekbench. And Spec 2017 shows very nice gains, like for example when Geekerbench showed like just how much more efficient the A17 Pro and the A18 Pro are still over the 8 Elite and the Dimensity 9400, they were shocked, right? Because that was not something borne out by Geekbench. So, yeah, like I'm just trying to tell you, I'm not saying that every device cheats like this, but there is still some like, oh, this is a full throttle app, right? Let's give it performance, but we don't give that performance to apps that we actually control ourselves, like the browser and shit like that. Maybe not every game unless you put the device into a specific game mode or something like that. For Apple, a lot of it is automatic. Like game mode right now enables on pretty much any 3D game I have on my iPhone or iPad, right? It doesn't engage in like my card game that I play, like Eastern European Durak, a game that most of you probably have never heard of, right? But it turns on in pretty much everything else. Just today I played some Temple Run on my Mac and it turned on game mode. Apple was not selective with that. They were just, oh, it's a game in our eyes, so let us turn on game mode. Yeah, benchmark results suggest very different performance points for select apps. Single core scores actually drop below the Pixel 9 Pro XL. And yes, if you know, of course, the Pixel 9 Pro XL delivers below 2,000 points in single core and benchmark. Atrocious performance for a 2024, like late 2024 product, or at least second half, right? Here you see, like in the spoofed app, the GT7 Pro delivers almost just 1/3 of the promised single core performance. Why it would ever have this gap, I have no idea. I would love to see a similar test run on other devices. I mean, they did not mention whether the S24 Ultra or the Pixel had like the spoofed app on it. But yeah, if you're somebody who really wants to test out your device and wants to understand your product, I promise you that benchmarks, especially for cheaper devices that might not have the most ambitious motherboards, the not most ambitious cooling solutions, they probably don't want to always leverage that kind of single core performance. And by the way, I just got that single core performance yesterday on my A17 Pro. I actively cooled my iPhone 15 Pro Max. I put it on my air filter at maximum. At maximum frequency, and yeah, I got the first time ever over 3,000 points, and I got 7,700 in multi-core. So this is why there are tests that show the A18 Pro deliver over 9,500 points in multi-core. And then yes, this one, the 8 Elite, of course, with its 8 cores, right? The 18 Pro only has 6 cores, could give you 10,000. But again, if in real world tests, and I would call this spoofed app real world because it won't trigger any optimized settings, when the real world is half of 10,000, I have to wonder how much do I even benefit from a 10,000 peak, and shouldn't potentially the 8 Elite not be a slightly smaller chip, slightly lower clock, so I could get more efficiency, more stability, even on products like the GT7 Pro. That's an alarming performance downgrades for apps that aren't on Realme's performance optimization tests. What's actually going on with the Snapdragon 8 Elite phone? We suspected that this is a case of benchmark cheating gone wrong by Realme. The phone runs the stock 3D Mark app at virtually full tilt with no regard for device temperature until it crosses a critical thermal threshold. What's more concerning though is that even the spoofed app yields hot temperatures, albeit not enough to kill the app, as we see the case with the stock benchmark. This suggests that even in the best case scenario, Realme's Snapdragon 8 Elite phone is stubbornly trying to stick to a high level of sustained performance at the expense of cooler temperatures. I would also argue battery life, longevity of the actual product, things like that, your user experience, because cooler temperatures aren't just like a chip thing, it's also defines even if you can still hold on to your product. The worst case scenario is that the company disregards thermal considerations entirely in favor of performance when it detects a benchmark app. Only the phone's built-in safety measures are saving us in this worst case scenarios. So they are saying that they have targeted optimizations for tests like Geekbench 6. I would assume that also is correct for stuff like Antutu. The company was previously banned by Antutu over allegations of benchmark cheating back in 2021. I wouldn't be surprised if some similar thing wasn't still happening. So just trying to tell you, the 8 Elite is actually a good chip. It's on N3E, it's a big chip, it's an expensive chip. But if you are buying into benchmarks telling you, oh, look, the multi-core is so much better than the 18 Pro or something like that. Oh, look, the GPU is 50% better because you're testing Wildlife Extreme like a moron. Like, there is a lot of complexity to that topic. And speaking of that complexity, thank you so much to James Atkinson at Jimmy James UK on Twitter for actually, it's not for me, he does it for everyone, he's a great guy, but I do always encourage him to add me in those posts whenever, and actually adding the Dimensity 9400 devices like the Oppo Find X Pro, he did it on my behalf, so Thank you so much here. Um, Follow him on Twitter, give him likes, leave leave an emoji thanking James here. He did actually compile some tests from Geekbench for this is obviously the 8 Elite, both in the OnePlus 13. Wait, the Xiaomi 14. I think he meant Xiaomi 15. I think this is a mistake because the Xiaomi 14 and 14T are a Gen 3 devices. So we do have, of course, the iPhone 16 Pro and Pro Max that are A18 Pro devices, and we do have a Dimensity 9400 product in the Oppo Find X8 Pro. You can see that in the geo-mean, when it comes to single core, iPhone wins. Now, some might say, oh, why is it pretty low in comparison to the peaks that we know, especially iOS 18.0.1 can hit, and now iOS 18.1, of course. That's because, of course, this is the geo-mean. It's not the average, but it's taking a lot of data and combining it. You still should assume that it's I would argue that most people, if you just test their device correctly, you probably can hit 3000 on your 8 Elite devices, even if this is more between 2800 and 2900. I would assume most Dimensity 9400 owners would be able to hit like 2750, 2800 in the single core, because maybe the highest cores are depending on like Silicon Lottery, but usually there's not like a gap larger than 2, 3, maybe 5%, right? So in the geo-mean, you have to consider that a lot of data gets included of devices that are very, very fresh from the press, maybe are having a lot of background tasks running. This is what keeps especially the A18 Pro down. A lot of people posting like benchmarks. They might have automatic app downloads and updates turned on. They might still be downloading iCloud data while they run their first Geekbench test. And of course, that means that some cores, especially some e-cores, are handling tasks in the background, and Geekbench can either not hit full core utilization or full frequency utilization. So the geo-means for multi-core, in my opinion, are not very important, but you can get the broader image here. The GPU multi-core high is also not very important, no matter how good the 16 Pro Max might look here still. To me, that test just suggests that like, oh, if you're willing to give your chip like 12 to 15 to 18 watts, maybe even for 1 second, this is the performance it delivers. But granted, how often would you want your device with like a 4,700 to 6,000 milliampere hour battery to ever use 18 watts? It's just bad for the user experience because very quickly your battery would drain. Even the highest capacity 8 Elite devices wouldn't perform too well here. So yeah, very nice though to see that like we are now over 9,000 across the board, and 8 Elite, thanks to its 2P cores, 2 prime cores, and 6, let's call it performance cores because that's what they call it, can hit over 10,000. Definitely makes the X Elite look bad because obviously the X Elite is 12 performance cores. Yeah, but it makes me a little bit more excited for a potential X Elite 2. When it comes to single core high, we see that, of course, we see some of the architectural advantages that even Geekervan mentioned, especially in tests like Spec 2017, where both A17 Pro and A18 Pro weren't just faster, but also more efficient than the Dimensity 9400 X925 chip and the 925 core and the Orion second gen core in the 8 Elite. That being said, when you really ramp it up to like your 4.3 gigahertz, I assume that means in like a overclocked device it could hit like 3300, but Apple's single core result is still in a league of its own. that is, of course, the best case scenario. Most of you are probably getting a little below that, maybe in the 3500 range. I almost, for single core, like, I know it's a weird way to look at it, but I almost encourage you to create a middle between the single core high and the single core geo mean, and you probably can expect most chips to hit that kind of high, right? Because it offsets a lot of like that early wrong testing that I mentioned. It would offset some of the silicon lottery that you might not win, right? So here it would be like 3500, here it would be like 3050 in around that. Here it would be like 2800 or something like that. Again, it's not a scientific way. Those are more scientific individual data points. But that's about how I encourage to look at it. Regardless, shout out to just the general state of the smartphone chip market. Everyone uses here N3E. Everyone is trying something by themselves. The GPU architectures have also improved. So plenty of good stuff here. I would say this is the most competitive chip year we've ever had, which is obviously really good. That being said, that's about it for the 8 Elite in terms of like peak performance that we have. We have people like DameTech also saying that most real-world devices will be closer to 8.8 to 9.4K. We see that, of course, proving out in the geo means that Jimmy James UK provides. And some people are now testing their devices. You can see the testing here on the OnePlus 13, definitely not hitting 10,000 in a regular way. We see how Apple's device can hit anywhere to close to 9,000 multi-core to way beyond that. But in single core, I would argue Apple is very stably over 3,500 if you have a decent chip. And when it comes to stability, you actually find that the lows are pretty much equal. So you have like pretty low stability on the OnePlus 13 here. So it drops to the 3300 in the lowest loop score, as does the iPhone 16 Pro Max. But the 16 Pro Max does that with 69% of its performance still intact. While here we have a much higher peak of around, like, what would it be? Like, let me open my calculator again. 6600 divided by 4900. What? So that's a 34% increase. That still is a sizable lead here for the 8 Elite, but alas, you see that this performance was really unstable up and down, while Apple just thermal throttled it once and then held on to that performance for the rest of the runtime. This is why I know a lot of people ask me, why doesn't Apple give us way more GPU cores and stuff like that? Well, if they gave us, like, let's say 8 GPU cores, right, which would be 1/3 more cores, which would likely lead them to have the exact same top performance. And this is, again, Wildlife Extreme, which Wildlife Extreme really doesn't benefit Apple's architecture too much. It likes a lot of raw memory bandwidth rather than the system-level cache that Apple tends to utilize, which is more efficient. It has a lot less data transfer necessary. So if Apple did that, they would have the exact same issue. So maybe at 8 P cores, maybe at 8 GPU cores, you could distribute that task like more evenly. So maybe it could hit like at the same power consumption where it hits like 3385. Maybe it could hit like 3600 or something like that. But that would be an investment in a larger GPU, so a larger chip, a more expensive chip, and a chip that still wouldn't be able to hold on to its peak performance for very long. And unless Apple gives you more thermal headroom, which is okay. I guess that is a reasonable ask. But then they would also need to give you a larger battery. And now we are looking at a very different product, right? Down the road, I see Apple give you, for example, 8 GPU cores once they go with a 2 nanometer processor. Who knows, maybe even with N3P, but I wouldn't bet on it. But I'm just telling you, like, there are reasons for why Apple doesn't give you like a 140 square millimeter A18 chip. It's because even a device, and I think the OnePlus 13 actually has a more impressive thermal system than the iPhone 16 Pro Max, you can see how little of that peak performance is sustained. And you also, of course, have the fact that not everyone who buys Pro Max devices even uses them for gaming. So Apple tends to invest more of their die size into the CPU. These days, they also care a lot about the neural engine because of AI marketing. So however you want to see it, adding just more cores wouldn't have necessarily solved the problem for either phone here. By the way, we mentioned like peak temperatures of like 46 degrees on the Realme, on the Xiaomi 15 devices. This is the Xiaomi 15 Pro. You can see it hitting up to 50 degrees Celsius. This is definitely not a comfortable product to hold. No idea why they push it that far, but you can see that it maintained its stability. It had actually a lower peak versus the 6600, but it did have also a much higher lowest loop score. So it started a little lower but ended a lot higher, which obviously in stability terms means it's much more stable. You can see that it also didn't have ups and downs. It just gradually kept reducing what I would assume to be frequency to manage thermals. But alas, even with those managed thermals, it came out to 49 degrees Celsius, which I know in an individual spot is not bad, but apparently that was hit rather across the product. So yeah, definitely not the greatest result. Speaking of the Xiaomi 15 devices in general, they do seem to not target the absolute highest performance the 8 Elite has to offer. You can see this is the Xiaomi 15, not the Pro, so the Pro will probably perform in such a test better, but this is Antutu, and Antutu, for example, is being advertised by Qualcomm to be hitting around 3 million. So having only 2,200,000, let's round up to 250,000, that's a noticeable, like 20%, over 20% reduction. So just trying to tell you, just because some reference products promised you that efficiency or that peak power or something like that, that does not mean it's going to be replicated by every product having that chip. Tipomaster, comparing square millimeter is misleading since they can integrate the Qualcomm modem. Apple currently can. That is true. I'm not saying the entire difference between 105 square millimeters and 140 is based on the GPU. Absolutely not. In fact, I'm actually telling people that the GPUs are much more similar than a stupid test like Wildclef Extreme makes it sound. Apple's cores and cache are all rather big. Yes, their P cores are big. Their system level cache is big. Of course, the 8 Elite, the Dimensity 9400, they do have more cache these days than before. Cache on 3 nanometer isn't actually more dense than it was on 5 nanometer, which leads to much larger chips, believe it or not, if you want to give a chip a lot of cache. So this is what makes the Dimensity 9400 and the 8 Elite the most expensive chips ever, like the most expensive like smartphone chips ever by MediaTek and Qualcomm respectively. When the Apple modem is integrated, it will be more comparably, though still different. Yeah, exactly. For one, it seems like at least the first gen or two of Apple's modems will not be integrated. Part of that will probably so that Apple can use that modem across like different products, products that would otherwise have different chips anyway. So maybe down the line, Apple starts integrating modem tech into the, especially especially the A series chips, right? But then there's also the issue, for example, the iPad, right? The iPad does not feature like 5G by default. It can, but it doesn't always. So what would Apple do in that state, right? Would they use potentially like modem chips where the part of the modem had to be binned? Would that be the most efficient way? Or would it just be the most efficient way to keep the A series chip and the modem separate? And then of course on the M series chips, like some M series devices have 5G supports potentially, like the iPad Pro. The MacBooks don't. Would it make sense to have the 5G modem integrated? Would it make sense to have only the Wi-Fi modem integrated? What if at some point they make one modem for Wi-Fi and 5G? Would it make more sense to keep that on the die or to make that a separate chip? Yeah, it will be interesting to see. I've also said that Apple making their own modems will be very, very good for them financially. That will allow them to have larger orders from TSMC. It will also allow them, especially while they use separate modems, to double down on orders for older nodes. Right? It's rumored that the first Apple modem will be actually built on some version of 7 nanometer. I assume probably 6 nanometer, which is actually produced right now in the US. The first TSMC factory has actually great 6 nanometer yields. So maybe that would be a great way to Apple to go to the US government and say, look, we built modems here. We even built some older chips here still, right? And then down the road, 5 nanometer, whatever. Well, actually not. What node is actually produced at Arizona? I believe it's 4 nanometer now, right? Not even 6, but 6 nanometers obviously in ample supply, so the point still stands. Does TSMC have a 6 nanometer factory inside the US, or is it only for 5? TSMC, let's say 7 nanometer US factory. I always mix that up. Well, the North American semiconductor, TSMC reportedly uncovers Huawei's plot. No, I believe it was 4 nanometer, right? Where they hit like better yields than they did in Taiwan. TSMC to begin official production of 4 nanometer process. Oh my God, some websites are so freaking slow. Yeah, at the US factory next month. Okay. But do they have also a 6 nanometer factory, or did I just imagine that? Because, yeah, they are making Apple's A16 chip, which is built on 4 nanometer. But it just, like, what will Apple even use the A16 chip at that point in? Would it just be for like some, because even the iPhone SE is rumored to be like on A18 or A17 chip basis, so it can support Apple Intelligence and have 8 gigs of memory. What will they do with A16s? I'm just a little confused by the state of TSMC factories outside of Taiwan. But yeah, Tipo Master. That was a very long, convoluted response from me, but yeah, I fully get your point. There is a die size difference that is largely based on the integrated modem, not on the GPU differences. Even though the GPU, I believe, is actually still bigger on the 8 Elite die than the A18 Pro, but I'm not sure. Plus, again, there is also the different consideration that, of course, Apple has a lot of potential in its system level cache, which technically is neither CPU nor GPU, but it's usable by both. So however you utilize transistors is very different between Apple's approach and Qualcomm's approach. Yeah, that about ends it with my discussion about the Snapdragon 8 Elite. Again, I do want to see more results from actual production devices. I do want to see them maybe after like I don't know, like Android 15.0.1 or like a smaller stability and bug fix release, right? Maybe even something like that. Those Realme issues will be figured out. But for now, I am pretty much saying the state of the smartphone chip market is pretty good, whether you're looking for a 9400 device, an 8 Elite device, or an A18 device. You really can't go too wrong. Now, could you potentially go too wrong with an alternative chip that's supposedly going to be coming next year? Now, for a long time now, we have had so many conflicting rumors about the state of the Exynos 2500 SoC, which of course is the successor to the Exynos 2400 and would most likely be Samsung's first smartphone 3 nanometer chip. By 3, I mean like their GAFET chip. So actually a very advanced node, potentially extremely competitive with like TSMC's N3E. And not too long ago, we've been more or less in the state of mind that no, the Exynos 2500 is either delayed or completely canceled. With delayed, it would most likely find its way into something like the next gen Galaxy Fold or something like that, but not in the Galaxy S25 and S25 Plus. There was a big chance that Samsung would be using only Snapdragon 8 Elite devices across the entire world. There was some questions about maybe them utilizing the Dimensity 9400 on cheaper products. But apparently, thanks to a Geekbench test that has come up, a lot of Geekbench stuff, Geekbench talk today, is Samsung Exynos 2500 SoC actually popping up. And of course, suggesting that it might actually come to the Galaxy S25 and S25 Plus. To be honest, that is not a confirmation. This could also just be some legacy device that still like ran a test. It could be spoofed for all we care. It could be the Exynos 2500 that is maybe currently tested in a design similar to the DS25 products, but actually it will only be ready by the time like the next Galaxy Z Fold comes out. So I'm not saying this is a confirmation, nor am I saying that the actual performance that you see here is correct. Most likely the Exynos 2500 would just have the main like they have one highest end P core clocked at 3.3 gigahertz, which would suggest it is basically something similar to the X4 core. But it does outperform the X4 core because the X4 core at 3.3 gigahertz is more at 2200 single core. So maybe it's an underclocked X925 core. Also, it comes with 12 gigabytes here, so it does seemingly point to being the Galaxy S25 Plus. So I cannot tell you. There were even rumors about Samsung struggling with the Exynos 2500 yield, but it looks like the situation isn't as bad. I still am saying one score sheet here does not suggest that the chip is actually coming out. But they are jumping to different conclusions. They're saying the score sheet showing the Galaxy S25 Plus running on the unreleased Exynos 2500 is solid proof that some market will get the Exynos treatment. Not saying it's impossible, but I'm saying it's a very confident take based on one benchmark. We also get to see the CPU configuration. It is 10 cores. The prime core is 3.3 gigahertz. The GPU is the Eclipse 950, powered by AMD's RDNA architecture. I'm actually not sure if using RDNA is any kind of benefit at this point. Like with how good the Adreno GPUs are and how good like AMD's custom designs are, not sure. So, I mean, it still says ARM v8, but at this point, every freaking chip just says ARM v8 in the name. So, while previously ARM v8 might have been indicative of a chip actually being ARM v8 based, that is no longer the case. The main core could be like an X925 core, could be a custom core design from Samsung. So I actually couldn't tell you. As far as the scores are concerned, we suggest you don't read too much into those. This is obviously a pre-production samples, so don't make comparison to the 9400 or the 8 Elite here. So I am giving you the same info. I'm surprised by how some people are taking this as a confirmation, especially knowing that you can spoof those Geekbench tests pretty well. But maybe if we see more and more such tests coming from different sources over the next couple of weeks, and maybe, of course, if some big Samsung leaker like Ice Universe comes around and tells us, oh yeah, the Exynos 2500 is actually real and some markets are getting it for the S25 and S25 Plus, maybe that will be true. So yeah, again, a 3 nanometer chip. What was actually the rumored like exact architecture uh for the Exynos 2500? Because I am not sure what the prime core in it was supposed to be. Exynos 2500. Some struggles existing confirmed in Samsung latest earnings call. Samsung S25 to only use Snapdragon chips, so that's the rumor I was referring to. 3 nanometer Exynos 2500 tipped to be more efficient than the Snapdragon 8 Gen 4. Maybe it would be the X925 core, but potentially lower clock because Samsung's GAFET node might not be very friendly towards higher clock speeds. Let's see. This is rumors from almost a year ago of what exactly would be happening inside the Exynos 2500. So that would be Samsung's second generation 3 nanometer process, apparently better than TSMC's current 3 nanometer process. That comparison at that point would have been made towards N3B. And yeah, they are calling it the Cortex X5. The Cortex X5, of course, ended up being called the X925. Clock speeds, again, up to 3.6 gigahertz in the Dimensity 9400. Maybe Samsung will use slightly lower clock speeds. But again, what we saw here was like a pre-production model at 3.3 gigahertz with surprisingly low single core performance. If you add less than 10% to it, that still wouldn't match the 9400. Maybe they give it less cache or something like that, or maybe it's just a pre-production issue. We have over 8,000 points in multi-core. Of course, that's partially a result of having so many E-cores or intermediary cores, like with an overall 10-core design. And I would assume that maybe some clocks here would change as well. Like, if we actually look here, so it would be Cortex A730, A730 lower clocked, and A520. So the A700 series is not actually seen as efficiency cores. They're kind of more like lower power P cores. And yeah, the A500 is the actual E cores. It's a little concerning to see it be still the A520. It seems like ARM isn't really that keen on keeping improving the A520 because it's not that great of an E-core. But I guess if you make it a 4-core cluster, you can still get a lot out of it. So yeah. Just saying, maybe the competition will actually heat up even more early next year than we expected. Who knows? We have had rumors about the S25 Ultra being delayed. Are there news about it? Can I find that? S25 delay. Okay, that's Berlin. Thank you very much. Google is so... Samsung hit its Galaxy S25, cheaper foldable, and the XR. That's not really interesting to me. That's also chip stuff. So Samsung delays One UI 7 until some point in 2025. So there were some rumors, maybe I cannot find them, that the Galaxy S25 series could launch like around a month later in the year than the Galaxy S24 did. So that to me would be somewhat indicative, of course, of the fact that Maybe it's One UI 7 that's holding everything up. Maybe it's that they're still desperately trying to bring the Exynos 2500 to the base models. But yeah, the state of Samsung here is definitely interesting. Um, Actually, when we look at the Galaxy S25 specs, right? So we know pretty much what display it's getting. We know it will be getting a slight redesign with slimmer bezels and stuff like that. Supposedly, the display is still an M13 material display, so it won't have the most efficient panel. And most likely, the battery and charging is staying the same, and the main camera stays about the same, and the ultra wide goes 50 megapixel. So that's going to be the one main camera change. That doesn't look very promising if they don't reduce pricing, or they like there's rumors that the base version would still come with 12 gigs of memory. At that point, if they really want to hang on to like $1,300 base pricing, I would really encourage them to just make 16 gigabytes standard. Maybe just make the base version 16 gigabytes and 512 gigs of storage, and then a 1450 model with 1 terabyte, right? Which would still be cheaper than what Apple charges to upgrade from 512 to 1 terabyte. Again, not saying it's possible, because Samsung does have other costs here, like the S Pen. And of course, it is their main product that makes the highest amount of profit. At least for Samsung Mobile. They do, of course, have like their storage, their RAM, which are wildly more popular than their smartphones. But just saying, it does not look too good if they price it at $1,300 and still make it start with 12 gigs of memory and 256 gigs of storage. But I guess we'll have to see how it actually pans out. Definitely will be watching like head-to-heads between it and the iPhone 16 Pro Max. I would assume this device probably will end up with worse battery life than the S24 Ultra, and definitely worse battery life than the 16 Pro Max. Given what we know from the power consumption of the 8 Elite, and knowing that the iPhone uses M14 material screens, and this will not, at least according to Ross Young. So yeah, definitely a lot of interesting stuff happening early next year. My last topic of today, this actually is more interesting to me. Let me know if you like that kind of talk. I rarely talk about PlayStation, but usually when I do talk gaming on this channel, it is PlayStation related. The PlayStation 5 Pro is, of course, releasing on November 7th. I do believe we should be getting reviews like tomorrow. We got like unboxings yesterday. So if I look at Digital Foundry, maybe there's a review already on the... no. Okay. And I know some people have started early testing the PS5 Pro. They basically stole it from some stores or something like that. Or maybe they work at those stores and that means they have early access, I guess. PS5 Pro review. Maybe like IGN has something, or... No. Okay. So all we got were unboxings and explanations. And yes, in those unboxings, we did have a spec sheet. So I briefly wanted to cover some interesting stuff. Of course, we do know it still is in Zen 2 architecture. We do not have a confirmation of the fact that it can hit 3.8 gigahertz. But given that everything else kind of makes sense, it probably does. Maybe they don't want to give you a maximum frequency. Maybe they're still working on it. Maybe they could decide to give you at some point 4 gigahertz or something like that for some games to finally hit 60 FPS. We have 16.7 teraflops of an unnamed Radeon architecture. RDNA graphics, so they do not clarify if it's 3.5 or 4. It's very likely to be a mix. with basically the core raster architecture being more like 3.5, but some ray tracing technology being taken from RDNA 4 and the AI acceleration being taken maybe custom from PlayStation, maybe from RDNA 4, remains to be seen. We know it has faster 16 gigabytes of memory, but it is still 16 gigabytes of GDDR6 memory over a 256-bit bus. What's interesting is it does have extra DDR5 memory, similar to how to the PS5 Pro had 1 gigabyte of extra DDR3 memory. This has 2 gigabytes of extra DDR5. So I assume that will be something that is used for the system, and that is what will allow the GPU memory to basically be like, instead of like almost 13 gigabytes to be almost 15 gigabytes of it to be usable. That's good. We of course have the 2 terabytes of base storage. The original PS5 came with 825. Then the PS5 Slim had around 1000 or 1024. So this has a full 2 terabytes. It still supports the same kind of PCIe 4.0 NVMe drive. So I will actually have 4 terabytes on my PS5 Pro. I'll probably tomorrow take out my C brand. No, what is it called? Seagate. My Seagate SSD out of my PS5, the original one with 825 gigabytes. And so I'll have 1.2 terabytes more storage than I had in my original PS5. We have USB-C slots, ports similar to the PS5 Slim. So it loses one USB-A of the original and replaces it with a USB-C. It still has one fast USB-C port that supports PlayStation VR 2, which I'll definitely be testing. It has a larger power supply here at 390 watts. What's great is this to me basically confirms that this is a 4 nanometer chip. We know the original PS5 came with a 7 nanometer processor and then got a refined version that had a 6 nanometer chip that allowed them to make the PS5 Slim. I actually don't know what the weight is on the PS5 Slim. PS5 Slim weight. That one was 3.9 kilograms. So we already were like below those, which some say 4.3, 4.5. Maybe that's the difference between the disc or the diskless version. So we already had a weight reduction on the PS5 Slim, and now the PS5 Pro is actually the lightest PS5. Like, really? The digital edition weighs 3.9 gigahertz. So, yeah. Well, the digital edition is 2. Wait, why is there such a big, like, why are people so bad at this? Console weighed 3.2 kilograms. Okay, so that would put it much more closely to the PS5 Pro. So why not? Okay, so I guess whoever wrote that shit up top, that meant the original one, which is Google is really, really getting bad. Okay, so the weight is not lower than the. Well, if it is 3.2 kilograms for the PS5 Slim Digital, 3.1 would still be lower weight than that. So that to me would suggest that all that extra power is actually surprisingly more efficient too, and they were able to further reduce the thermal system in it thanks to the higher efficiency of 4 nanometer versus 6 nanometer versus 7 nanometer. Now the power output is relatively high. I assume that might be just support for accessories that is built into it. I assume the actual like power draw during games will be very similar to the PS5 Slim. Yeah. this is where I would expect there is some overhead here to connect your PSVR to the Wi-Fi, the wireless receivers for audio accessories and things like that, to charge your DualSense controllers via the USB-C ports and stuff like that. It's a surprisingly large power output to me, but I would have expected them to keep around 350 watts given the efficiency advantages. I don't know why the comparison here is versus the regular PS5 rather than the PS5 Slim. Um, Maybe I can have that somewhere. PS5 Pro versus Slim specs. That's all German. Compare spec designs. Okay, so yeah, they did not have that extra data, unfortunately, at that point when they were writing that that article. Maybe there's a news thing. That's all just 1 month ago. What the actual? That's Push Square. So I assume that's the same article we just read. Here's actually an image comparison. So you can see the PS5 Pro has the same height as the original PS5. It can fit the exact same disk drive as the PS5 Slim. So that's logistically just better for PlayStation to implement. It has those racing stripes. It is slimmer. So than the original version here. And yeah, we just saw it has surprisingly low weight. And for the actual games that you will be playing, well, I guess the last spec I should mention, which again, this is such a weird comparison because for some reason they do not mention something like Wi-Fi 7, but okay. But actually, thanks to PlayStation, is we know that the PS5 Pro comes with 50 optimized games at launch. So that will be on Thursday. Now, some of those games have not yet received the patches for the updates, but there are some big titles here, like Alan Wake 2, which is getting much more advanced ray tracing in its 30 FPS mode and higher image quality in its performance 60 FPS mode. I actually think this list isn't full. Wait, is it even 50 games? Following it will support it as per Sony. I guess I don't want to count it, but like, so we do have a lot of Sony's games, especially a lot of Insomniac's games like Spider-Man. We don't actually know, for example, what exact improvements God of War Ragnarok will get. We know that Hogwarts Legacy is getting pretty big ray tracing, especially in its 30 FPS mode. We do know that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is getting a huge image quality increase in its 60 FPS mode. So a lot of good stuff, but I do actually think that the list will keep expanding maybe. So, and some notable new stuff, for example, here is Pal World, which just recently came out on PlayStation, and Call of Duty Black Ops 6, which of course is now a Microsoft-owned title, and which means that the best console version of that game will exist on the PlayStation platform. And there's actually a new game, game PS5 Pro. Empire of the Ants actually has a 60 FPS mode on PS5 Pro. It's a Unreal Engine 5 game that is designed for photorealism, but on the Xbox Series X, the regular PS5, and of course the Xbox Series S, it only goes up to 30 FPS. So for all people who said that, oh, you know what, games will not be pushed to 60 FPS if they didn't already have 60 FPS mode on the regular PS5, some have talked about CPU limits. Now, granted, this game will probably not be an example of CPU limits, but we already see games like Baldur's Gate 3 and Dragon's Dogma 2 see surprising FPS games on the PS5 Pro that suggest that maybe even its 10% increase in clock speeds could give enough headroom for titles that were previously more like well, I understand that in some scenarios like Baldur's Gate 3 and Dragon's Dogma 2, they will drop into the 40s or even the 30s, like in complex cities where there are a lot of NPCs and stuff like that. But when you're playing outside, a lot of those games were still running at a very nice 48 to 52 FPS, right? And then they were also mostly GPU limited, and that's exactly where the PS5 Pro comes in, especially if a game was limited by some of the ray tracing performance. This is where you will get like 2 to 3x gains with PS5 Pro. Granted, it will still be held up by some of the bandwidth limitations, and the raster can only go so high too. But yeah, I think if you had like a benchmark title that was just ray tracing, like a path trace title, that would show like huge increases on PS5 Pro. But we'll have to see how all those games actually perform. I'll probably receive my PS5 Pro this Thursday, and I'll probably play it a little bit in the night, but I actually going out to celebrate my birthday this weekend. My birthday is next Tuesday, but I will be celebrating it a little earlier to make sure that I can actually come together with family and friends. So I'll probably be having a birthday stream next week. Let's see how that turns out. Hope you guys join. Hopefully by that time we'll also have, of course, reviews and more benchmarks for like all the M4 devices, which are launching unfortunately on Friday. So that means I'll probably be not able to stream until Monday, because I am returning only very late on Sunday and I am celebrating on Saturday. Maybe I'll have a small stream on Friday. I'll let you know if that works out. Maybe we'll quickly go through some of the reviews, some of the benchmarks, and then I'll just go into my relaxed weekend afterwards. Yeah, but for now, this is it. We have been streaming for over 2.5 hours. We still have over 10 people watching, which is honestly double the amount that I expected. Especially once we pivoted to PlayStation topics. So I hope you guys have a nice day, a nice week. I will be still streaming this week, depending a little bit on my mood, depending on how I sleep tonight, as I try to digest the news of the incoming US election. So this was a very nice way to distract myself. Thank you guys so much. Thank you for joining. Thank you for contributing to the live chat. As always, while I end this, do the YouTube jazz. If you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, please consider doing so. Like the video, share it out to anybody who you think might enjoy it. Comment, please comment not just live, which you guys are very good at, but please also comment on the actual video. You can do that right away after the stream ends. I keep those videos as VODs on my channel. And of course, consider supporting the channel directly through super chats or stickers right while I'm live. Leave a small donation in the super chat. It goes a long way, keeps me engaged, makes your message a priority for me. You can become a channel member right here on YouTube. Shout out to Angelica, Max, Maximus, and Steve, who are MarkTech Pro Max level supporters. And you can also support over on Patreon. There are a few different tiers there, including a free one, which will still give you access to contact me directly. And of course, the best way to contact me directly is still by following me on Twitter, which I will call Twitter in perpetuity. That ugly X button by that ugly MFer. Just never. So feel free to follow me there. Feel free to share data with me. I've given you examples of how I love integrating data. I'll give you a shout out, give you a big thanks. And of course, it will help contribute to the community, to my videos. So that would be incredible. Or just ask me questions, give me your opinions, give me, of course, suggestions for content you would like to see going forward. And with all that being said, a last thank you for today. I wish you all a very nice US election day. And I'll see you next time. Thank you so much. This is MarkTech tuning out.